The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to Odysseeware's webinar, How to Support Your State's Unique ESSA Graduation Requirements Using Odysseyware. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Tyler Wood from the Odysseyware marketing team and your webinar host for the day. Presenting today is Steve Rowley, CEO of Acumen Partners. Steve has been working with policymakers for many years and involved with ESSA since its inception. With more than 20 years of experience in business management, Steve has had an illustrious career in business and education. Prior to Acumen Partners, Steve engaged in principal leadership positions in leading education organizations, including Pearson, McGraw-Hill, Master Teacher, HMH, and EdLights. We are excited to have Steve present for us today. But before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. Attendees will be on mute, but feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation using our chat feature. We will review and organize for Q&A at the end of our session. So now I would like to turn it over to Steve to kick off our webinar.
Thank you, Tyler. And I want to first thank everybody for attending today and reinforce the message that Tyler just gave you. This is an important topic for all of us, graduation requirements. A lot has changed since No Child Left Behind, and a lot is coming into effect this year with graduation requirements. So use the question feature, make sure that you're funneling those through. We're going to take time after the presentation to answer questions, and we'll be able to respond even after the webinar to some of the questions that you've asked. I want to make sure that you have a chance to get all of those questions answered. One of the purposes that we have for today's webinar is to make sure that everybody's really clear on what some of the changes are, how they're impacting you in your individual school or local education agency, and what questions to ask your state education agency so that you know what to expect this year and for the next 5 years or foreseeable years as new technology, new processes, new calculations for graduation rate take effect. So let's start first by introducing ESSA or ESSA and its relationship to graduation rates. One of the great things that ESSA has brought to education across the country, and I know there are a lot of positives and negatives that people are expressing regarding the change from No Child Left Behind and into a new set of federal regulations. There's always going to be challenges, and there's no perfect system. But there is a huge plus for ESSA, and that is that it provides a lot of flexibility to the state level as they deal with key requirements of the law. So the federal government has empowered the state education agencies, the legislatures, and the governor's office to look at the needs of the state and still qualify for federal educational aid. One of the critical factors is this ACGR, which we're going to explain on the next slide further. But this graduation rate, ACGR, adjusted cohort graduation rate, is a critical measure on almost every aspect of ESSA. So how successful students are in preparing for college and career readiness as measured by this ACGR is a critical measure for more than one indicator in ESSA. So that's the message to take with you in the back of your head as we go through the rest of this presentation. One of the key elements as well for everybody to keep in mind is that as you look at graduation rate, really we're not looking at a flat or a dead statistic. We're looking at the culmination of what happens to a group of students who start at the beginning of 9th grade, their first time in 9th grade, and travel through 4 years of your local area school district or local area agency's high school program. And what the federal government is interested in with ESSA is that we're collecting information on students as individuals. The older practices where we took averages and we looked at groups, the number of students who came into the year and the number of students who left the year, and hey, it looks like on average we lost 10 kids, but we gained 11, so we actually graduated more than we started with. Yay, we're really successful. That is not allowable under current guidelines, under current regulation. So the idea that we're now wanting to account for every student and understanding how each student is progressing through the educational system, that is the focus of ESSA. So, one last point on this slide, one of the keys to understand too is that even though ESSA is a federal regulation, and that it is governed in terms of accountability through Title I, it has much greater impact on the state education agencies than just Title I. So all of us have been through the process in the last 18 months of working with state education agencies as those states prepared their instructional plans or their accountability plans to be submitted to the federal government. That preparation, those plans govern all instruction that takes place within the state. So they're not just setting a federal plan so they get the federal dollars, and then they have another instructional plan or set of goals for the state funding. The way it works now is they've put together a plan that combines state and federal accountabilities, and they're looking at one holistic movement to reach each student as a whole learner. So what we're providing today regarding ESSA is relevant to your state, even if we're not talking federal programs. So the rules we're talking about, the principles we're talking, the questions we're going to help you understand, those things are all applicable across the board, regardless of whether we're talking federal money or state money or local money. All right, with that in mind, let's get one thing really clear on everybody's mind. That's this statistic, adjusted cohort graduation rate. So what you see on the screen here on the right is a very complicated equation. At least it looks complicated. Lots of words are involved there. And on the left, you're going to see two acronyms. One of them is ACGR, which we've just defined as the adjusted cohort graduation rate. And next to that is the AFGR. So if you're looking at statistics produced by the NCES office or the Department of Education out of Washington, you'll see two numbers that reflect for each state. One of them, the ACGR, is the number to be looking at. Another number that you'll see from time to time, particularly in older reports, is this AFGR, the average freshman graduation rate. We're not going to spend any time today talking about that. Understand that it's essentially a dead statistic. It's helpful to some degrees. There will still be some states who look at that, but it is not considered transferable from state to state, and it has no funding or accountabilities attached to it. It's just an interesting number. So since it has no accountability, since it's really not relevant to the work that you're doing in the classroom, it's an older model for calculating graduation rates. We're going to let that one disappear for a little while. And our focus should be on this concept of the cohort model of graduation rates. So in the numerator, one of our goals here is we want as high a numerator as possible. And in the numerator, as educators, we get to count the number of cohort members, and that's measured as the number of freshmen who enter a class for the first time their freshman year. And everybody who comes in school that year is considered part of that primary cohort. And they'll travel together and be counted together for statistics from their freshman year through the end of their senior year. So it counts all of those kids from their freshman to their senior year, plus the number of students with the most significant cognitive disabilities who have been reassigned from previous cohorts into the current cohort, and that is only done when they're eligible for an alternate state diploma. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but the goal for us as a community of educators is we want that numerator to be as high as possible, and the lower number, the denominator, that's something that we want to reduce as much as possible. And that one includes all the same number of students, everyone who started the ninth grade together, and anybody who transferred in during the 4-year period of time that we're counting this group, and anybody who transferred out. So we're going to take the same number, we're going to include people who transferred in, and we're going to exclude people who transferred out. This is a major change to how graduation rates were calculated in the past. It sounds familiar, but the method for transferring people in and transferring people out has changed. So under No Child Left Behind, it was actually relatively easy for school organizations to massage their graduation rates somewhat using special populations, accounting for people who have left or are unreachable, and dropping them out of the denominator for the calculation, and that gave us an artificial boost to the graduation rates. And all of those actions are justifiable. So I don't think there's anything that at least I would point out that was incorrect or unethical about those practices. They were part of the process. Under ESSA, those practices have come to an end. They are not to be done. So the cohort model, the thing to really understand about the cohort model is actually this statement here down at the end. Once in a cohort, students can only be removed if they transfer their records, and that means they transfer their records to another school in the district, to another school within the state, or to another degree granting school within the country, the United States. And if they transfer their records, you are able to confirm as a school administrator or district administrator that little Bobby went from school A in your school district to school L in a different state, and you're able to confirm and document that his records have transferred and he's counted in a cohort in that other state, you can count him as transferred out. Unless there's that documentation, written proof, that he is going to school in another degree granting organization in another state, then he has to stay in your cohort. The only other ways that they can be transferred out is if they go to jail, in which case you have a documentation that they are there, and if they are counted, if the jail provides an instructional program, they stay in your cohort and you watch the child graduate. If they're in jail with a non-degree program, so they go to an adult jail that does not have a high school diploma program, then you may remove them from your cohort. If they leave the United States, so they go to live in Europe, you do not need to have confirmation of a degree-bearing organization in Europe, but you do need to have written confirmation that that student has left the continental or the extended boundaries of the United States. And the only other way is actually if the student dies. So this is how the law reads, that students can only be removed if they go to a different school, in which case they are transferred and counted in a new cohort. They go to jail, they leave the US, or they leave this earth. Unless one of those four things happens, the student will be counted in your cohort for the denominator purposes. So it is likely that many of you will have students who drop out of school, in which case they would drop out of the numerator, but still be counted in the denominator, meaning that your adjusted cohort graduation rate would be impaired, it would be impacted. And these cohort definitions are not flexible. So that's one thing to really remember. The goal here is to be able to compare across all 50 states, all educational systems within the United States that are reporting to the federal government, and say that all of them have similar requirements for graduation, and we can compare state to state, knowing how many states are using the funds provided effectively to graduate students. So if we look for where the accountability is in the states, it's under, or the states are obligated to the federal government. The accountability is between the state and the federal government. So ESSA, or ESSA, provides for accountability of state education agencies. Within any given state, the accountability from a school to a school district, or from a school district to the state education agency, is defined by the state itself. ESSA does not prescribe that level of accountability. It only prescribes how a state provides information to the federal government. So one of the requirements for the states under ESSA is to provide a really clear accountability plan. This is the plan that they wrote over the last 18 months, submitted to the Department of Education, and most of which have been approved by the DOE for federal funding. So the big state accountability plans, that's what we're talking about here. The SEA has to have defined what a graduation diploma looks like. So ESSA did not prescribe what has to be present for a graduation diploma to be given. It only says that the state has to have an acceptable definition. So your state came up with its own definition, its own requirements for graduation, and they can, under federal guidelines, also approve an alternate diploma for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. So when we look at your degree granting authority, under ESSA, you have the ability to issue a standard, regular graduation diploma saying that a student has completed the requirements that your state has set for successful completion of high school, and they are ready for career or college, or they have succeeded in achieving an alternate diploma, which is set aside for those students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. We'll talk more about that here in just a minute. Understand that all students who are eligible for either one of those diplomas are counted for your adjusted cohort graduation rate. So for your ACGR, all students who are eligible are working towards either a traditional graduation certificate or diploma or an alternate, and those are defined by the state and submitted to the federal government already. Those are who are counted for the purposes of your graduation rate. One of the requirements is clear and public reporting across the state for all stakeholders to have access. So the data that comes from your individual school, from your local education agency, for all the others across your state and at the state level, all have to have transparency in the data and how those things were calculated. That is now a mandate. And the subgroups, there's two sets of subgroups that the federal government requires for each state. One, we'll talk about in a moment, those are mandatory subgroups that the state is responsible for sending data in. And then there's a second flexible group of students in subgroups that the state will apply other means of funding. So when it does its reporting for ACGR, it will include certain subgroups that are mandatory, and then we'll show you those in a moment. And for most programs in the state that are run by the state, and it talks about subgroups, most of that conversation is going to be around these state subgroups, the specialized subgroups that have been individualized for your state purposes. So there's two sets of subgroups. That's an important point to remember here. All right, the last set of requirements for the state is they have to have this really robust, fully operational data system by this year in order to exchange information with the federal government. So the accountability from your district has to go into a fairly advanced, robust technology tracking and reporting system for the federal government. We'll talk about that in a minute. They have to have clear business rules, and by that it means not the conduction of business and the transfer of money. It means what are the operational practices? How does a district get information to the state? How does the district collect information? How does it need to be documented? Those are the business rules that ESSA is talking about. The state is required to perform audit-ready data quality checks on its own internal systems and has to be able to access and perform similar record keeping or data checks in local area agencies. So the state needs to know that the quality of the data it's getting is traceable and is of high quality to the individual level, and then tracking that from individual to school to local education agency up to the state. And official documentation has to be maintained for each student that is recorded in the ACGR. So that's a lot of data tracking the state is responsible for. And that means that there's got to be a lot of things that we used to just draw a line through or skip this documentation or fudged an answer for, that now we won't be able to do with quite the same level of simplicity. We'll have to track down a written response or an email from a parent or something from the student in writing or a doctor in writing and put that in the student's file, and that digital copy will be transferred with the student's record wherever that student goes. So let's talk about the real impact here. What happens at the local education agency or in the individual schools and classrooms of a high school? We're going to go back to the cohort rule we talked about earlier. Once a student's in a cohort, once they're counted at the first day of their 9th grade year, their first time through, they are tracked for 4 years and are expected to complete high school graduation within that 4-year period of time. And they can only be removed from that cohort if their records are transferred, in which case we need record or proof of where they were transferred to and a written confirmation that that was received. They can go to a jail, in which case we have a written record that the student is in a non-degree bearing organization. They leave the United States, we need record that they've left the United States, but we don't need record that they have been accepted to a particular international school. If they pass away, if they die over the course of their high school, then they can be subtracted from the cohort. So this is now a really hard target. It's a hard number, and it doesn't change very often. And when it does change, it's with great consideration and careful documentation. So that gives us a level of high confidence in the number. It also puts work burden on local education agencies and teachers and administrators at the school level for collecting and tracking documentation carefully. I think the real key here, before we look at the burden that's been placed, is really to step back up and look at what the purpose of ESSA is, and really why all of us got into education in the first place. And that was, for most of us, to make a difference. We wanted to work with the children that were coming into being, our next generation of leaders, our next generation of adults, and make sure that we made a difference on an individual level. So from some perspectives, ESSA can look like it's quite burdensome and as a stranglehold on us as educators for doing our jobs. But the intent here is actually to give us flexibility, to hold us accountable for the monies being spent, making sure that we're using them to get a result. On the other hand, and reporting what that result is, but still to keep the focus on the individual or whole learner. We want to build capable adults. And one of the keys to understanding this is the idea that subgroups, the idea previously where we could remove subgroups from certain calculations. So if we had a high English language learner population, we could account for them differently to better reflect our school's progress. Or if we had special education students of a certain classification, we were able to massage our graduation numbers to better reflect that. Under ACGR, those subgroup exclusions are not allowed. So there isn't difficulty on how do we want to record a student to best reflect our graduation number. The reality is the student's already accounted for. They entered 9th grade, or they moved into that last phase of their schooling, they are in the ACGR. So it is our job as educators to make sure that they're moving in the best possible way towards graduation, either with a regular certificate or an alternate as provided by the state. So really, the rest of our conversation today is going to be on what questions are we asking? What should we be looking for as educators to tell us that we're understanding and going to perform best for the students in our care? So first question there, what are my state's graduation goals? Every state has set short and long-term graduation goals as part of ESSA. So your understanding and knowledge of what those goals are is central in your ability to execute those goals. So some of the things you might ask is, how does our LEA or school goals compare and contribute to the greater whole of the state goals? How do we reflect as part of the state? And are we contributing to the success there? What currently is the biggest obstacle for performing or improving our local goals? What's holding us back? Is it a population of students? Is it the level of unpreparedness they come in with? Is it the high transiency rate? What is the obstacle for us? And then how are we going to address that to achieve our accountability goals? And what instructional supports do we need to have in place in order to overcome those obstacles? Those are some key questions that are associated with achieving the state goal. Another key question is closely related here is, what's the timeline? Every state had to set goals and then say, by this year, we will have achieved this outcome. ESSA did not require a certain outcome by a certain date. States selected their outcomes. So this, as you look at the state goal, you are looking at a unique set of factors that are derived just for your state. And the benchmarks and timelines were established with an understanding of your local needs. So the question is, what is your baseline? Where are you starting with your graduation rate on a local level? At your local school or for the district, what is your ACGR? And then what actions do you need to establish the first milestone as defined by the state in the state education plan? So getting a copy of that section of the state education plan is really important. And then, you know, over the timeline established by your state education plan, you need to be asking, what do I need to do, or what do we need to do on the local level to help the state achieve that? One of the biggest misnomers here is that schools that have high or low performing populations and are at the most at risk because of their ACGR are under pressure to perform at the highest. That's not true. Schools that deal with the most at-risk students are going to be evaluated and cared for as far as graduation rates go in the long term based on percentage of improvement. So if you look at your population and you look at the fact that you're starting with an earlier intervention model, so you're not starting at 9th grade to intervene, but you're working with kids at an early childhood or an elementary or middle school level, so they're coming more ready into 9th grade, and you know that 10 years from now your rates are going to improve a lot, but it takes a long time for your efforts to show. Well, that is accounted for in your state's goals and in the way that you'll be evaluated as a local district. So I think there is a hope here that says because it's individualized, I have a chance of succeeding with this measure. One of the troubling aspects, or the more challenging aspects here, is how do you count what used to be unique exceptions, elements that we would try to remove or minimize in the calculation of our graduation rates? ACGR is rigid. Calculations are rigid. You have an option, and some states have exercised the option to say, here's our 4-year, but we also want to count our 5-year graduation rate and our 6-year graduation rate and make that an official measure for our state. So the federal government still provides the funding and allows the state to say, we know we're on the hook for the 4-year, but a lot of our students are coming from challenged backgrounds and they don't complete it in 4, but they do in 5. Your state has made a decision already if they're going to also submit a 5-year adjusted cohort graduation rate and a 6-year. There's no limit on these extended ones, but they're done at a state level. So you need to understand or ask your state, do we have any extended year ACGR that's been provided for in our accountability plan? And if the student or the child that you're working with has some unique needs, understand that they will be counted towards the ACGR. So the real goal here is, are they going to be counted as part of a significant cognitive need, or do we need to move them forward aggressively towards traditional graduation? And if somebody's transferring out or dropping out of school, how is that going to affect us? There is a strong incentive built in for schools and districts to take every action possible to keep students active in the school system and learning. So that is why this rule is so restrictive, is ESSA is intending to keep every student counted for and moving correctly towards graduation one way or the other. Oh, just a point about migrant students. There is a federal database that's accessible now by every state, every local education agency, and every school in the country that helps track and helps document migrant students. So if somebody moves into your school and they're a migrant student, or you suspect they're a migrant student and you don't have any documentation, go to the national database, check there, because that information is actually a pretty high quality. The last time we checked, it was actually, I was very impressed with the quality of information there. So they are doing a good job, not perfect, but a good job of tracking a majority of students who are moving from place to place, state to state, or who are considered migrant. So that's a first place to go. And in that database, you'll be expected to contribute. If somebody transfers out, you need to show what happened and where they're going. If somebody's coming in, they'll reach out to you to get the documentation. So it's an active place for you to be participating, and it helps you with your ACGR to do so. We talked about this a little bit earlier, the idea that for special populations, that there really are only 2 options for credit in your ACGR. One of the biggest questions that we get a lot is, what about the special certifications? What about the IEP recognition or diploma that my student received? They weren't part of the most significant cognitive delay, but they completed everything that was necessary according to their IEP, and therefore were given a graduation diploma. That that diploma does not count for the school towards ACGR unless it's one of those two, a traditional diploma meeting all the requirements for that, or it is the alternate diploma defined for students with the most significant cognitive needs. The alternate exit certificates now do not count towards graduation rate. So IEP diplomas, career and college ready certifications, GEDs, none of those count towards the ACGR. This is not a statement that those certifications have no value. It is for the purpose of this statistic, they are not being counted. So many states have chosen that even though they are not being counted and reported to the federal government as a formal graduation, they have created their own metrics around these exit points, whether it's an IEP diploma or a GED, that they're reporting in addition to the ACGR. So this is an important question. If you are working with a school or a population that deals with students with unique needs, to understand how is your data going to be reported and how will this reflect on your ACGR. There would be an immediate incentive for everybody to take every student in special populations, and instead of having them work towards graduation diploma, the traditional diploma, to have them work towards an alternate diploma. And on a local area, on a local agency or in an individual school, that is actually not precluded against by ESSA. So an individual school could pursue a strategy where everybody, you know, in theory, worked towards an alternate diploma and had a 100% graduation rate by those requirements. The challenge is at the state level, no more than 1% of students total can receive an alternate diploma and still receive the federal support. So the state will have a problem if everybody pursues alternate diplomas, because 99% literally of the students have to be counted towards an ACGR, a regular graduation, versus an alternate graduation. So there is some dissonance in the system between what the local needs are and what the state can report as having been there. And I am positive at this point that states will be carefully looking at why schools are using alternate diplomas to make sure they don't exceed their 1% gap. If a student truly qualifies, then the student should be awarded that. States will just be very careful, because under projections right now, most states will be very close to that 1% or slightly above it. So most states are going to have to be looking very carefully at their alternate diploma programs. And then the question is, what happens to students who aren't counted as successful with this graduation rate? This is just a statistic. I mean, in the end, it's important because it involves money, it involves what we do as educators and how we move forward. It's not the only statistic. So the graduation rate as measured by ESSA is not the true measure of success in a child's life or a young adult's life. Getting them ready for college and career readiness really is our mission. For accountability purposes, this is where the threshold was set by the federal government, and it's set the same for every state. States have the ability to look at other parameters and to choose to reward those parameters within their own state funding and within the confines of boundaries of their state. And so where you have students who may not be able to be counted in ACGR, that does not mean that you should not focus attention or efforts on them, or that there's no funding to support those students. That's not correct. It's just that if they don't count towards this graduation rate, then you need to work closely with the state to understand what things the state is making available. There is a large push for college and career readiness, and a traditional graduation certificate, a diploma, is not necessary to qualify for many of those programs. You know, what about late year graduates? This has been an ongoing challenge in lots of locations where a student isn't ready by May for graduation on time, but they're close, and they use that summer program to graduate. In the past, that has been a very questionable element. Can we count that as an on-time graduation, or does that not count as an on-time graduation? ESSA has cleared up that problem for us. The answer is you can count that as an on-time graduation if a student takes a late year graduation. So they finish, they're done in May, they're missing 2 credits, they work really hard and recover those credits by the end of July. The only requirement is that data has to be to the state and has to be to the federal government no later than October 1st. So we don't get any extended time periods to send in information for students who are graduating late. There's no grandfather clause or no late application, so we can defend it by December 15th. It's now due, all data is due by October 1st. So if you can get the student through and get the data reported in time, then you have the option for this late year graduate, and it counts towards your ACGR. So, you know, that gives us incentive to pursue strongly these credit recovery issues or programs, especially in areas where students close to graduating. It's to our advantage as educators to make sure those students get that diploma. And then again, the next big question is, how does the ACGR reflect subgroups? There are mandatory subgroups, and those are much the same as they were under No Child Left Behind. So you get one ethnicity, you get the traditional disability, etc. subgroups, and then your state-defined subgroups. So it's really important that you work closely with your state, understand how the data that's being collected is to be received at your state level and reported forward, and what the significance of that is. So understand your state's definition of graduation. Understand that it's an individual student by student number, not an aggregate or an average of the entire class. It's really important that we strategize on connecting with students right away in their 9th grade year and making sure that if they're behind in their academics, that we get them caught up as close to the beginning of their 9th year as possible, and that we stay right on target for recovery if they're falling behind after any of their 4-year process. And you know, it is actually really important as schools and as educational professionals that we focus on flexible supports within the school environment. What can we do to reach students where they're not at? And we're going to be addressing that issue with some upcoming webinars here with Odysseyware. One of them reflecting chronic absenteeism on April 18th. So if you haven't already signed up for that, you know, I would encourage you to do so, because we'll get into some of these issues on academic supports in that webinar. And then we'll talk about assembling the evidence of effectiveness for the programs you're initiating and working on for the May 2nd webinar. Let me just quickly indicate that Odysseyware has an important role to play in schools who are fighting and working on these types of challenges. Odysseyware is a comprehensive digital online curriculum that has traditionally been used a lot for credit recovery. So the very issues we talked about today are where Odysseyware has built their reputation. However, under current academic requirements, Odysseyware now fits a lot of needs. Wherever the whole learner is a concern, so where we're talking about students in the early and primary grades to whether they're falling behind in their middle or high school grades, using a type of digital curriculum that has the ability to reach beyond the classroom and recover participation and engage students, that's really where Odysseyware is a valuable tool in your arsenal. The content that's been created, the data that's being recorded that affiliates or works with ESSA requirements, and the ability that you have to customize the experience for each student, those are the things that make this an asset where you're working against challenging requirements like those we just discussed. And Tyler, I think I'm a little bit over time, but if we have time, if there's questions, I would love to take those.
Actually, there aren't any questions. I think it was a really great conversation that you shared with us. It's a very complex topic, and we appreciate you sharing it. I know we're over on time, so I want to thank the participants for joining us. We understand this may be your only break today, and we truly appreciate you taking the time to spend it with us. Just to let you know, shortly you'll receive an email follow-up with the recording to ensure you have the details you need on this very important topic. We also have many upcoming webinars available on our website, as well as many pre-recorded webinars covering a variety of topics. So we encourage you to check those out. And as Steve mentioned, lots more coming regarding ESSA. So thank you and have a great rest of your day.